Welcome back. We wanted to put the anti-drag movement into some historical perspective, and I'm being joined by two guests to help us do just that. Dr. Leila Rupp is a professor of feminist studies and is the interim dean of the graduate division at the University of California, Santa Barbara, UCSB. She has studied and helped develop curriculum on sexuality and women's movements, and she's written books on drag queens and LGBTQ history. Also with us is James Jasper, who has taught sociology for decades, has written and edited over a dozen books on protests and social movements, including his most recent book, Gains and Losses, How Protestors Win and Lose. Leila, let me start with you. Everything old is new again. This anti-drag movement feels very retro. It feels repetitive. It feels almost so repetitive, it's a bit silly. Yet here we are.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right that it is something that has a long history. But on the other hand, it also there have been moments in American history in particular where drag has been very popular and really quite accepted. So I think the growing visibility of drag, you don't have to go to a gay bar any longer to see a drag show. You can turn on the television. And I think that has made it both more acceptable in some circles, but also more threatening. And so I see this really as a question of backlash.
Yeah, I was just going to say, why target the drag community now? I look at it, if you'd have told me this was 1983 and not 2023, I'd have said, yeah, okay, this is the moment we're in culturally. This is why it seems so odd. It feels like we got past this.
No, I think that's exactly right. But what I think this really is totally connected to the fact that gay and lesbian population has become more acceptable. Attitudes are much more positive. The attitudes towards same-sex marriage changed more dramatically than anything else. And so it's almost as if the movements that have always targeted this kind of gender, these kinds of gender issues have found a new target, and it's really trans. And drag queens and trans are not the same, but they have the same resonance for the groups that are really opposing them. And I think that's really what's happening.
James, how would you compare this current protest movement on the right to, say, Anita Bryant and what she did with, quote, Save the Children, which was an anti-gay movement? It was when teachers were finally given protections in the public schools in Florida, and, you know, it became this, she created this sort of boogie person movement regarding gay teachers.
Yeah, well, there are a couple resonances there. First, she, I think, helped pioneer a lot of the language of gay predators going after our children, right? The name of her organization was Save Our Children, not Stop the Queers. So a lot of this idea that these were people with an agenda who were grooming children, who that being gay or lesbian, that sexual orientation was a choice, and hence it could be a sin if you put it in Christian terms. And she was a fundamental evangelical Christian. So a lot of the language comes from there. It's not just that you know, to make this work rhetorically, you need not just villains, but you need victims. And children always make the best victims. They're most sympathetic. We pretend that at least that they're innocent. They don't know anything about sex. So if you can link any kind of LGBT activity to children, well, then you have the potential for the homophobic rhetoric. The other thing that reminds me, though, of this case is, and you mentioned this before, you have very blue cities in very red states. Yeah. And so you have this tension. You know, the Republican state legislatures have right within their own states people they can push around, people they can bully because they have trouble fighting back. So you see this in a lot of issues, not just on gender and queer issues.
James, let me follow up on, you know, how protest movements win or lose here. I want to put up some historical polling data on same-sex marriage. In 2004, the opposition to same-sex marriage was at 62%. By 2022, support for same-sex marriage was actually higher than that original opposition. It is at 65% the last time we tested it. It's an extraordinary shift in culture in 19 years, at least in the history of public opinion. Assess that protest movement. Why did it succeed so quickly?
Well, it is quite remarkable, and in my view, it was an issue that is kind of similar to the drag issue, which is, I think it's not a great choice of issue for the religious right. What happened with marriage, at first it seemed good, a good issue for them. They could they got some referenda passed against same-sex marriage. But as the controversy went on, you had story after story of these couples who had been together 20, 30, 40 years, these loving couples who had raised kids, who had grandkids, who had pets and wonderful families. And as all these stories came out, they turned out to be very sympathetic people. All they wanted to do was legalize the love that they had had for years. So there weren't villains. There weren't really victims because the kids that they had raised seemed like everybody's kids. There's no real difference, and there've been a lot of studies that have found, you're raised by same-sex parents or straight parents, there's really no difference. So I think that the drag issue will be kind of similar as time goes by, and we hear from more and more drag performers. Drag performers just want to make you laugh. They want to entertain you. They don't take themselves too seriously. They're pretty charming people. They are not predators. They're going to come off pretty sympathetically over time. So, hopefully, it will also be a very short time before this dies down as an issue.
And Leila, one of the other reasons I think that the same-sex marriage movement moved so quickly is there was more science proving that this is not a choice. Homosexuality is not a choice. You're born that way. As there more scientific research comes out about gender being on a spectrum, and more of that research, how important do you think that will be to the trans movement and to all of this?
Well, I do think it's very clear that attitudes about homosexuality, about being gay, and being trans are really affected by when people do believe that it is really something that you cannot change, that it is genetic, that it is in some way biological. And of course there is disagreement about that, but what I think is really important is that when people believe that it is not that it's something biological, they're much more likely to be supportive. And so I do think that there will be more change along those lines. Although it is clear that people's attitudes towards trans now they tend to believe that gender is formed at birth based on sex, but they also are more open to the idea that people should not be discriminated against because they're trans. So I think we'll see the same kind of development of a change in attitudes over time as people get to know people who are trans, because now they don't know, they're not very likely to have that experience.
At some
so I think it will follow the same way that attitudes about gay people changed.
At some point, many Americans are libertarian at heart, and they do eventually get there. Leila Rupp, James Jasper, really appreciate you coming on and lending your expertise to this topic.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.